Okay, good evening. It's late afternoon going into the early evening, so thank you for coming along. This is our final plenary presentation of today's conference. And to introduce Professor Celia Deane Drummond, we have Professor Darlene Weaver, who you met earlier, who's the Director for the Centre for the Catholic Intellectual Tradition at our school. Darlene?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to tell you a bit about Dr. Celia Deane Drummond. She received her PhD in Theological Studies at Manchester University. She also holds a PhD in Plant Physiology from Reading University. She is a professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame, where she is also director of the Center for Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing. That center advances research around three foci: origins, natures, and futures. Dr. Deane Drummond was previously a professor of theology and biosciences in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Chester. She is a fellow at the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies, a fellow at the X Center for Global Health, and a fellow at the John Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. She is also a lead faculty member for the People, Policy, and Environment Research Initiative for the Riley Center. Dr. Deane Drummond has received over $5 million in grants, including $1.78 million for a project on human distinctiveness and $3.1 million from the Templeton Religion Trust for a project on developing virtues in the practice of science. She has served on expert committees as a consultant, for example, for the Secretariat for the Commission of the Roman Catholic Bishops' Conferences in the European Union, and as a rotating member, or rather she's had several stints, on the International Advisory Board for the John Templeton Foundation. She is a founding member and executive committee member for the European Forum for the Study of Religion and the Environment. And believe me when I tell you that these are only a tiny fraction of her many appointments, roles, and accomplishments. Dr. Deane Drummond is also a prolific writer. Among her many, many books are Techno-Futures, Nature and the Sacred, Transdisciplinary Perspectives, The Wisdom of the Liminal, Evolution and Other Animals in Human Becoming, The Ethics of Nature, Creation Through Wisdom, Theology and the New Biology, and Genetics and Christian Ethics. She has also published dozens of articles in academic venues, both humanistic and scientific, as well as popular venues. Her expertise is called on by major media outlets, including NBC Nightly News and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And she offers presentations, such as the one you're about to hear, all over the world. We are fortunate indeed to have the opportunity to listen to and engage with so accomplished and distinguished a speaker. The title of Dr. Deane Drummond's lecture is Theological Anthropology of Laudato Si, Tracing the Interplay of Theology, Science, and Ecology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Celia Deane Drummond.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you particularly to the President, Ken Gormley, for the invitation to come here, as well as that from Gerald McGill and Dan Schneed. I was really honoured to be invited to come and speak this afternoon, and particularly delighted to see so many of you staying the course for this final talk today. So congratulations. I'm sure if I'd been you, I would have gone home. Anyway, so today I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper into the theological anthropology of Laudato Si. And we've already heard so much today about different elements of what that might entail, but I hope that by hearing some of this again, you'll find it sort of shed in a slightly different light. So the themes then, so I'm going to start off with the theme of our common home and ecology, where that comes from. The rallying cry to all people that Pope Francis has given in this incredible encyclical. Very different from any other encyclical because it's open to the people of the world in a way that no other encyclical has ever been. And so he begins with the ground up, literally. And he begins again with discussions around climate change, biodiversity, ecological matters. I'm not going to go into the science too much in this talk because I want to concentrate on the theological anthropology, but those of you who want to sort of ask questions about some of that aspect, especially the evolutionary aspect, I can deal with in the discussion later. But what I really want to get into today is one of the things is what does it mean to be converted? What does ecological conversion mean? How is it expressed in anthropological terms in terms of ecological vices and virtues? So we've heard a lot about how certain practices can be fulfilled in the talk we've just heard. We've seen this fantastic vision of Dan Schneid's on the common good. But maybe there's something that we can put in between those in terms of virtues, ecological virtues. And in addition to that, what does integral ecology really mean in terms of linking up with human ecology and ecology as such? And I'm going to point towards what I see as a more systematic theological approach which orientates the human and who we are as human beings in something I've called sublime communion. And then I'll end up with a few concluding remarks. So that transcendent orientation then is also the basis of hope, certainly for Christians, but it's also something that can be shared with other religious traditions. In this talk today, I'm not going to discuss the other religious traditions. I'm going to focus in on Christian theology because that's where my own writing has concentrated. But that doesn't mean that I'm not interested or think it's important to engage with other religious traditions. And one of the things I did while I was doing a doctorate on Moltmann's theology of creation was work with ICAREC, the International Consultancy on Religion, Education and Culture in Manchester. And the person who was directing that particular program, Martin Palmer, also set up the Alliance of Religion and Conservation. So I was very well aware, right from the beginning of my career as an academic, of the importance of practical issues of education, of scholars working together, especially across religious traditions. By the way, is this microphone working okay? Yeah, okay, I can't tell because it's. So let's think then about the kind of Pope that we have at the moment. And I know this may seem fairly obvious to some of you, but I think it's worth reinforcing that the style of papacy itself means that Pope Francis acts as an exemplar for what he says. So he walks the walk and he talks the talk. He refuses to have bodyguards. He refuses any grandeur of his office. He eats with the homeless on his birthday. He goes to Muslim countries, takes refugees from there and brings them back to the Vatican, and so on and so on and so on. He eats a common meal and lives in a common accommodation instead of in his own palatial accommodation. All these gestures are not simply gestures, they're showing us how even in his elevated position he can take steps to live simply and in solidarity. And he also shows then particular acts of mercy, which I think are really important. And he's inspired by Francis of Assisi, who is also the patron saint of ecology. And ecology itself, and we've heard a definition of this very briefly, but I'll say it again, is related to oikos or home, and but it's a very, very new science. Ernst Haeckel created this term, and he lived from 1834 to 1919. So really only in the last century has ecology come into our language. And at this stage it had a very narrow biological meaning. And for many people it still has this biological meaning. But since then, it's grown in its importance and has both political, social and theological significance. And many of you may not know that eco-theology has been around at least since the 1970s, and I've been working in this field of eco-theology for the best part of a quarter of a century. What Pope Francis has done is to say eco-theology is now something that the official church can sign up to. Although he didn't use that word, but effectively what he does in the encyclical is to show that he is an eco-theologian. At the same time, we shouldn't forget that economics can also have green agendas, and so can politics and so on and so forth. So it's not just, as I said, it's not just about narrowly about biology. And he points to a new form of humanity as well, and that new form of humanity, or through the idea of human ecology, is something I'm going to discuss. But in order to move us, if you like, to the first step of this conversation, I think we need to try and understand what ecological conversion, the kind of inheritance that he had from Pope John Paul II. And he used it in a slightly different way from Pope Francis, and initially he spoke to a general audience, meaning we need to turn to think more about ecological issues and biological issues. But this is something that he said in a pastoral address to the bishops. There is a need for an ecological conversion to which bishops themselves can contribute by their teaching about the correct relationship of human beings with nature. Seen in the light of the doctrine of God the Father, the maker of heaven and earth, this relationship is one of stewardship. Human beings are set at the center of creation as stewards of the Creator. So he allows us then to think about how we might act in relation to creation. So what is the correct relationship with human beings with nature? The correct relationship is one of stewardship, but is also premised on this idea of God as the creator of the world. And so it's laid down, as it were, foundationally by the Genesis account. Human beings made in the image of God, made to have dominion over the earth. I think it's useful to notice that at this stage he talks, Pope John Paul II is talking about human beings at the center of creation. That language of human beings at the center is never used by Pope Francis, so there's a significant change in the latest encyclical. At the same time, he talks about stewardship. So he hasn't lost completely this idea of stewardship, but he does avoid using things like human beings at the center of creation. At the same time, ecological conversion is also about metanoia, a change of heart. And this statement that came from the Pope John Paul II and Bartholomew I, the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarchate, in 2002, it was one of the most significant statements, I think, on what ecological conversion really means. And this is just a tiny snippet of that. And so it's a change of heart, a turning away from ecological sin. And it's something which, as President Gormley reminded us, is something that is now added to the sins that Pope Francis wants to reinforce from the special feast day for the celebration of creation that was in September earlier this month. At the same time, you can see here that a solution at the economic and technological level can only be found if we undergo it in the most radical way, this inner change of heart, this metanoia, which can lead to a change in lifestyle and of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. A genuine conversion to Christ will enable us to change the way we think and act. This idea of conversion to Christ is there in Pope Francis, and I'll have a slide on this later, but it's not there at the beginning. So he does use the language of ecological conversion and uses it for a whole section of the encyclical, but the conversion to Christ is downplayed a little bit, and I think that is a deliberate move on his part to try and bring as many people as possible on board. At the same time, he hasn't lost that vision that ultimately it's conversion to Christ that will really give us that motivation to change. So it's addressed then to all humanity, and again, that's unlike prior statements. He qualifies this idea of humanity at the center of creation, At the same time, he faces up to the root of problems and pain. He doesn't avoid that by flowery statements, but which then don't look at the nature of human sin. So human acts then are the root of the problem, wrong acts, as it were, towards the natural world. The physical problems we see, the earth is a pile of filth, and also the moral problems, the indifference to the suffering of others. These two are together. Behind the moral problems that we see, there is an over-attachment to certain other things. In other words, there's an attachment to the wrong kinds of things. And it comes then, he doesn't use this word, but it becomes a form of idolatry, that we've attached ourselves to the wrong kinds of things. We've become idolatrous in the way we live our lives. And so I would say that we need this encyclical is all about resisting the vice of idolatry. And one of these is an over-attachment to technology, social media, and so on. Another one is the lack of sensitivity to another's pain. And he says this of the media, that at times it shields us from the direct contact with the pain, the fears, and the joys of others, and the complexity of their personal experiences. So how many, and of course, that is also often true, although we have these huge divides now within the media where public debate is taken over by debates which emphasize differences rather than collaboration. But this is Pope Francis's interpretation of what's happening in the world of the media. So how do we begin to find humanity's place? First, he resists what's called unwarranted anthropocentrism. That's putting so much emphasis on our human needs that we forget about everything else. And he does this by giving intrinsic value to all creatures. And we've heard this from Dan's talk very clearly and beautifully. He also wavers a little, though, at times by talking about ecosystem services, and we've heard that term as well. But philosophically, ecosystem services is more or less incompatible with this idea of intrinsic value, because ecosystem services is about an instrumental view of the rest of nature. So I think that, so there are, if you like, elements in this encyclical that don't really always line up. But I think what Pope Francis is trying to do is to get everybody on board by using the kind of language that resonates with them. So when scientists hear and geologists hear the language of ecosystem services, they go, oh yeah, he knows what I'm talking about. If those who are more religiously inclined or even philosophically inclined hear intrinsic value, they say, oh yeah, I know what he's talking about. So it has this effect of generating a sense of this is a common problem. And I think that is, as I said, it's not necessarily philosophically that sophisticated, but it is in terms of a theological statement that is trying to move whole different groups together. It is very successful. In addition to that, he draws on the scientific consensus. There are maybe adjustments that he could do in terms of some of his use of biological language and evolution as well, but certainly in terms of climate change, those who've looked at this document who are climate scientists have no objections to that. And I think it's important to know that this is probably the first encyclical ever that's used quite so much science. No other pope has been as brave as he has. Now, he is also a chemist by training, so I love that information. When I found out that he was a scientist turned theologian and of course, Pope, I thought that was wonderful to hear that. So I think it's important because it gives him a different lens through which to think about some of these issues, where he's comfortable thinking about scientific ones, even if he could have gone further in places. So the role of ecologists, conservation biologists and anthropologists, they are elevated and affirmed. He talks about the value of scientific research. He's very encouraging to scientists, especially those who are doing this scientific work that's going to be helpful in terms of caring for our common home. So at the same time, this kind of goes against some people think he's very influenced by Leonardo Boff, but actually if you read Boff's Ecology and Liberation, you'll find that he's quite hostile towards conservation because he feels that that is a Western way of treating the problems in the natural world, and we should look at much more structural issues. Well, Pope Francis disagrees with Boff, although he doesn't engage specifically with Boff in this area. But, so he does affirm conservation, but he also confirms the value of looking at structural problems as well. So he says that the conservation issues are not enough. So we need to do both. We need to look at the issues of poverty and deprivation and look at the issues of the economic structures of society. But we also have to affirm, where there are people in the world that are working towards creating a better environment for those millions of other species that we share our home with. At the same time, he's also critical of what he calls destructive cultural values, especially that loss of the sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which all civil society is founded. So he's saying here, in a sense, that this is beyond Democrat and Republican. It's beyond the battles that we see in the media about Hillary Clinton and Trump battling it over the presidency. It's beyond that. These issues are far more important than that. And if we don't respond in an appropriate way, we will, as it were, undercut the very basis of democracy. So the very basis on which civil society is founded. So it's time to acknowledge that light-hearted superficiality has done us no good. When the foundations of social life are corroded, what ensues are battles over conflicting interests, new forms of violence and brutality, and obstacles to the growth of a genuine care for the environment. And so will this be a watershed then, in the way that I think that Silent Spring was a watershed years ago, in terms of turning people to environmental issues or not? I think the difference here compared to Silent Spring is that for Pope Francis it's an underlying faith in God that motivates what he's speaking about, an underlying faith that God is also there with us in some of these difficulties. At the same time, he avoids the kind of gloomy pessimism that we get in many secular environmental ethicists. Dale Jameson, for example, has written this book called Reason in a Dark Time, where in the end all he says is that we just have to rely on localized agreements, and that's all we can expect or hope for. Pope Francis wants to push us further and think about international agreements and international action, as well as action at the local and the national levels. So it's cultural transformation that he's after, a cultural revolution. And this comes out of the particular variety of liberation theology, that's the Argentinian variety where he comes from. It's a theology then of the people, for the people. Its stress then is not just on social and cultural change, although that is there, but also it's open to the insight of the sciences and natural philosophy. He doesn't develop the kind of biocentrism that Leonardo Boff and others from what I call an offshoot of the mainstream liberation theology. But at the same time, he does allow for the value of all living things, but not the value of all living things indiscriminately. He still gives the value to humans at the end of the day, is as it were, affirmed more than that of other creatures. And that happens in spite of his attention to interdependence and so on. So at the same time, what I'm going to do next is pick out things which may not be quite as obvious in the encyclical, but I think are really, really important in knitting it together, knitting all the different threads together. And that is the theological threads and the vices and virtues. So he's not just a prophet of doom. he has a very strong theological message that will appeal particularly to Christians. And so it's that what I'm going to concentrate on next, although it could be also resonant with those who are not necessarily of any particular faith. So, because he's talking here about ways of being authentically human, where we discover, as it were, our true humanity. And so he refuses to split care for humanity from care for the natural world. And he talks again about impoverished humans, those that are poor. So it's not, I always use the word those that are poor rather than the poor, because if you talk about the poor, it sounds as if it's just the state they're in, and as it were, it's part of a natural order. But actually, people living in poverty are living in poverty because the structures of society have put them there, almost inevitably. And so we need to talk about those that are poor and do something about it. And he draws for this part of his work on the Latin American and some of the Southern bishop statements in a way, again, that's remarkably unique for Catholic social teaching. So what are the 8 theological threads then? First one is praise, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn. Another one is gift, love, hope, glory, faith, joy, and humility. So some are recognizable virtues, like faith, hope, and love, the theological virtues, and the virtue of humility. Some are practices, like praise. Some are theological, what I call theologically informed ontological states of being. Now, if you don't like that philosophical language, it just means the way we become who we are intended to be by concepts like glory, gift, and joy. Gift, of course, is related to the virtue of gratitude. But it's that sense of gift which I think comes first. So, first of all, the most obvious one, perhaps, praise. Pope Francis gives creatures agency in their own praising. It's not just a metaphor for human praise, it's actual the praise of creatures themselves. That joy that we see in the living out of their being what they are. And the language comes from the canticle. Some of the language is figurative, as he speaks of brother sun and sister moon and mother earth. But the language of agency, I think, is intended to be real rather than just figurative. And humanity's praise is in concert with that of other creatures. So here's his own text. Praise to you, my Lord, in the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and our beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. So praise enlists the emotion of wonder and awe. So it elicits that time and time again. Of course, it goes the other way round as well. Wonder also elicits praise. So the two are, as it were, in a dance together. At the same time, instead of praising God, the creatures are silenced. He doesn't use this word, this is my own interpretation, but it follows from his discussion of Romans 8:22 that the whole earth groans in travail, groaning and in common with those who are marginalized or oppressed. And so there's need for mercy because of what we've done. Again, as I said, one of the sins that we have committed. So this sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. The whole earth groans in travail. And I was glad that we had, if you like, the view from outer space in the last theological talk of this afternoon, because it's true that it's only in the sense of getting away from it all, as it were, that we begin to perceive what an amazing gift that the earth is. And it's awareness of that gift that leads to a deep sense of gratitude gratitude to God and gratitude towards one another. So nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood and controlled, whereas creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all, as a reality illuminated by the love which calls us together in universal communion. The question is, how do we move to the awareness of gift from the from the more manipulative tendencies that we have, the over-attachment to technologies, the over-attachment to the culture around us? How do we begin to participate in that universal communion? And for this, Pope Francis uses that piece of the puzzle that's already been put in place by Pope John Paul II, and that's ecological conversion. So it's ecological conversion, again, is about interrelationships between each other and the natural world, but by the end, it is about conversion to Christ. So the gift is only experienced fully and recognized deeply in relation to our relationship with Christ. And this leads us automatically then to think about love which flows from love of God as creator, love for each other and love for the natural world. And God, of course, creates through love, and I would like to say also in wisdom. So just as happens when we fall in love with someone, whenever he would gaze at the sun, this is Francis of Assisi, the moon or the stars, smallest of animals, he burst into song, drawing all other creatures into his praise. So love provides then a check on unlimited freedom, this idea we have freedom to do whatever we will. It inspires us to awe and wonder at the beauty of the natural world. In addition, integral ecology, which comes just before this passage, just before a passage on love, is at the heart of what it means to be human. So because all creatures are connected, each one must be cherished with love and respect, for all of us as living creatures are dependent on one another. So love resists then irrational confidence in progress. It's a different way of thinking about the world. It's a different kind of mentality. It's one that we need to tune into, as it were, by our own experiences with the natural world, by our experiences with one another, to extend this understanding of what love is by if you like, exposing ourselves to those opportunities. At the same time, our lives are so interwoven with other creatures that we can't separate the love of one another from the love that we have of other creatures. Hope, again, is another important theological virtue, and it's hope that another world is possible, and it points to the common good, the good for all and the good to each. And it extends to the different nations of the world, including the specific responsibility of the richer nations to act in a way that's in favour with poorer nations, so they can start building an ecologically sound forms of governance. So it's not enough just to talk about love and hope. We have to actually begin to put structures in place that allow those who are hopeless, as it were, to have a real sense of hope. So hope would have us recognize that there is always a way out, that we can always redirect our steps, that we can always do something to solve our problems. And all it takes is one good person to restore hope. But hope theologically is different from optimism, because hope is always, optimism is the assumption that everything will work out, whereas hope it reminds us that God is present even in the midst of disaster. And I think that's important to bear in mind, that even when the future is uncertain, we can still look to this idea of glory, that we do have this perspective that God's glory will come, regardless of what happens to us here. And that promised interdependence means that glory is inclusive rather than exclusive. It's a glory that's reflected between God, humanity, and the natural world together, So together with our obligation to use the earth's good responsibly, we are called to recognize that other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. By their mere existence, they bless him and give him glory. And so behind the hope of glory is the quiet presence of the Holy Spirit, that Spirit which is the characteristic of the Spiritans in this university. It's so important, even though it's not emphasized too much in this encyclical. When he does mention it, it shows that it goes way and above the number of references to the Holy Spirit's presence. And so with the Holy Spirit, even in the midst of difficulties, something new can always emerge. And beneath the surface, bubbling beneath the surface of this hope, we find the virtue of faith. And faith allows us then to interpret the meaning and the mysterious beauty of what is unfolding. We can interpret the world around us then in a different kind of way through the lens of faith, just as St. Bonaventure believed. He always believed that the natural theology was premised on the basis of faith rather than the other way around. So it's not like the natural world leads us to God, it's just through the lens of faith we see that natural world in a different kind of way. At the same time, faith convictions can offer Christians and some other believers as well ample motivations to care for nature and for the most vulnerable of their brothers and sisters. So notice that together again, reminding us again and again that it's both and, not either or. So humanity has a special vocation to lead all creatures back to their Creator. And in that we find joy, but joy is, again, as I call it, an ontological state that's not the same as happiness. Joy isn't the same as happiness, because happiness is often associated with getting what we want, whereas joy is much deeper than that, and it's related to the virtue of temperance, of holding back, of not taking more than we really need, the ability to have self-restraint. So Christian spirituality proposes a growth marked by moderation and a capacity to be happy with little. It's a liberating faith that presupposes a different model of progress, and we've heard this already in this conference, a different model of progress that's not just about GDP, it's about something much deeper. And so the ecological virtue related to temperance is that of humility. Once we lose our humility and become enthralled with the possibility of limitless mastery over everything, we inevitably end up harming society and the environment. So what joins up these 8 threads then of joy, glory, praise, gift, love, faith, hope, and humility? Peace, shalom, and wisdom and justice are those threads. So justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, with the overall whole as shalom, which is a Hebrew term meaning more than just peace. It's something that goes deeper than that. It's a peace that's inclusive with creation, whereas practical wisdom allows us to consider what justice might mean. It's not always clear what the common good is. It's not always clear what justice might mean. Practical wisdom allows us to work those things out. And it's also in relationship with wisdom proper, which is insight into divine things. So we have the wisdom, as it were, the virtue of wisdom proper, which is about divine things, that is in the classic tradition. But we also have practical wisdom. And although Pope Francis doesn't talk about these explicitly, or occasionally uses the word wisdom, it's my reading of this encyclical is this is exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to weave in these theological threads to talk about divine wisdom in relation to our human wisdom, and then show us how that informs our practical wisdom, our practical decision making that we've heard so beautifully in the last paper. So integral ecology then joins together the practical and theology, and practical and the theological. And finds a way of expressing what that wisdom is about. John Paul II used human ecology, Pope Benedict XVI used social ecology and authentic human development. Pope Francis uses integral ecology because he wants all of those ideas to come together. He wants the environmental, the economic, and the socio-cultural to come together. And he also avoids the term natural law, which could have been associated with this. But at the same time, he stresses the importance of human dignity, the common good, and others that seem to presuppose some form of natural law. But if you like, it's a softened version of natural law. And it's a language of glory rather than beauty. It's a language of sin rather than violence. And but its intention is a universal message. So he's modifying, as it were, some of the theological language in order to get others on board. And the virtues follow ecological conversion. So what they all need is an ecological conversion. This is at the end of the encyclical, whereby the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around us. So he calls then for a simpler lifestyle. So technology based on the use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas, need to be progressively replaced without delay. So these are really practical suggestions. And I'm showing these slides from some of my work with CAFOD, because it reminds us of what a more simpler lifestyle is about. So in other words, we have something to learn. But Saint Teresa of Lisieux was also an inspiration for Francis, and she was a French Carmelite who died young at the age of 24 of TB, and she lived in the 19th century. And she's, according to some reports, almost as popular as Francis of Assisi. And her stress was on the little things that we can do day by day, the daily gestures, the little things. And it's something then that everybody, whoever you are, whatever role you have, can affiliate with. And so integral ecology at this level is also made up of simple daily gestures which break the logic of violence, exploitation and selfishness. In the end, a world of exacerbated consumption is at the same time a world which mistreats life in all its forms. So rather than political revolution, he's asking for cultural change and change in covenantal relationships. And environmental education should facilitate making the leap towards the transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. And that's something I think that this conference has shown, that environmental education is also points towards this other leap towards the transcendent. So religious groups can, if you like, come on board with some of these other practical initiatives that we've heard about. At the same time, this sort of overall cultural revolution speaks of a special compassion and solidarity, which moves away from an overdependence on our technologies. And I think that both in terms of our human interests, widening our sense of human interest, but also the need for dialogue, a part of what this cultural revolution is all about. So what kind of, or what framing does that dialogue take? First of all, it's between religions, and we've heard about that in the last talk, so I'm not going to speak about that. It's even within sciences, because each can tend to become enclosed in its own language, and I know this for working as a plant physiologist, where I was situated somewhere between ecologists on one side and molecular biologists on the other. The two parties didn't speak to one another. Why? Because they were enclosed in their own language. Religion and science, again, another way of navigating this dialogue. But this demands patience, self-discipline and generosity. And we need, again, it's coming back to this idea again of ecological conversion to these practices, which are armed with virtues. But this isn't an optional extra. Living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to the life of virtue. It's not optional or secondary of our human experience. And this is if we're going to say anything to the churches as a result of this conference, I think this is one of the most important messages. That this isn't just an optional add-on to our social justice teaching. It is actually essential to the life of virtue, because it's part of who we are. It's part of our very being itself is to be expressed in this way. And then I'm just going to, my final few slides are going to talk about the eschatological vision, as it were, towards which this tends, as a way of sort of reinforcing why this is so fundamentally important to our Christian experience. And so we need to think then about, towards the end of the encyclical, about the destiny of creation. Where is it heading? And this part is ecclesial in tone. It's also Eucharistic as well as cosmic. And so it's a position then on the sacramental life of the church and widening that out to be inclusive. So the destiny of creation then is projected towards divinization, towards the holy wedding feast, towards unification with the Creator himself. And that's not Pope Francis. He's quoting here deliberately Pope Benedict XVI. And in the Eucharist, fullness is already achieved. It is the living center of the universe, the overflowing core of love and of inexhaustible life. And that is referring back to a Teilhard de Chardin idea, but it's a Teilhard that's quoted through Pope Benedict XVI. And I think that, again, is significant, the way he's using that particular text. But it's the basis for right relationships, both Trinitarian, the mutual love of the three persons in the Trinity, which is the ultimate basis of right relationships, but also through the Virgin Mary as exemplar. So it's an idealized vision of Mary as one who cares for us as the mother of us all, but also the mother of the world. And just as her pierced heart mourns the death of Jesus, so she now grieves for the suffering of the crucified poor and for the creatures of this world laid waste by human power. Transfigured, she now lives with Jesus, and all creation sings of her fairness. And so this theological anthropology then is fairly traditional in this respect, but it also points to the dignity of human beings, faith in God as creator and in Christ, and the stress on the importance of the family and the importance of Mary as exemplar. Will this work in terms of the cultural revolution that Pope Francis wants? I'm not sure, but it is at least a wake-up call to change, a wake-up call to move in the direction of this cultural revolution. He also reminds us of this sublime communion, paying attention then to the heart as well as the head. And so the summation of this sentiment comes here in this idea of sublime communion. The created things of this world are not free of ownership, for they are yours, O Lord, who love the living. And this is the basis of our conviction that as part of the universe called into being by one Father, all of us are linked by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion, which fills us with sacred, affectionate and humble respect. And so finally then, just because I know I'm running out of time, a few conclusions, brief conclusions. There are lines of continuity and discontinuity with other papal social teaching, Roman Catholic social teaching. What has been more at the periphery of these prior social teachings is now at the center. Humanity includes then consideration of the natural world. It's entangled, the natural world is entangled with us. But it's at the same time, it's grounded in the priority for the poorest of the poor and those that are the most marginalized. It's a multidisciplinary liberation theology, a liberation from vices, a liberation theology for the West, a liberation from the vices especially of the rich who consume so much more at the expense of others, who are caught up in this technological paradigm. It is designed to inspire change, to convert our hearts and not just our minds, to see a new way of living is possible, to stress those virtues of faith, hope and love, humility and temperance, justice and peace, connected to the idea of the integrity of creation. Further, in praise, we see the glory of God, which leads to most profound joy. The wisdom allows us to see a right way to act and also a right way to belong, both to each other and to God. It's a fruit of deep contemplative prayer and contemplation. It's an anthropology grounded in daily gestures, but also big dreams. Dreams for social change and the common good. It's a Eucharistic encyclical that provides the spiritual resources for change, but not detached from the natural world. So the message then is upbeat, but not romantic. And he ends with this phrase towards the end of his encyclical: "Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and concerns for this planet never let us lose. Let us move us away." Sorry, I can't read my own writing. The joy of our hope. And then finally, my final text, which I'm going to have to read out. This is how he ends. It's an end which I think is a cry from the heart, and so it's a cry to all of us as we try and stay awake at the very end of a very long day. O Lord, seize us with your power and your light. Help us to protect all people, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love and beauty. Praise to you. Amen. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for some questions. Do you want to stand or sit?
I'll stand. I think.
Okay.
Just if I get tired, I'll sit down. Thank you. I just want some water.
Is there a microphone?
Thank you very much. Something you said there intrigued me, and that is that creation is meant for divinization. Even though it was said by Benedict XVI, just what I want to know is, what does that mean? Creation is meant for divinization. What does it mean? And what are the implications for theology, eschatology, and so on?
Okay, thank you. That's a very, very interesting and important question. I think the idea is that we're not alone in our divinization. So in a sense, by participation in the Trinity, as it were, we become slowly divinized, more like Christ, more like God. But we're not alone in that process. There's a sense in which we're caught up, we're entangled, we're embedded in the whole of the natural world around us. I think there's been a discussion amongst different theologians as to what that might mean in practice, whether it means that every creature that's ever lived on this world that's now gone extinct is also going to be there in heaven, or whether it's just representatives of the different species in orders and so on. But what I do know is that those, our relationships with other creatures are not insignificant, that we have become, I know this from the evolutionary anthropology, that we've become who we are through those entangled interrelationships. Every cell of our body has a mitochondria in it, which is a bacteria that's come to inhabit our inner sort of cells. And our guts are populated by millions of bacteria. We couldn't live without those other creatures. So if we think about ourselves as being resurrected, then we have to think about other creatures being divinized as well, unless we somehow have a body that's not even remotely similar to the one we have. So I think that in a sense that we can't avoid that entanglement and interconnectedness. now, Pope Francis doesn't really explain exactly what that means in this encyclical, so it's up to theologians like myself and others to try and interpret what that is. And I think that it's sometimes quite difficult to do that, because at times he does, as I say, stress this interconnectedness, but at the same time he also wants to give human beings a special value, as it were, in God's eyes. So he doesn't level the playing field and make every creature exactly the same as every other. He thinks there's something very distinctly unique about human beings. And my own work as a theologian recently is trying to work out what that human distinctiveness really means in the light of evolution and our interrelationship with other animals. So it does lend itself, I think, for new interpretations of eschatology and new interpretations of what the next life might involve. But at the same time, I don't think we should be so romantic about this that we kind of assume that every single bacteria, as it were, is necessarily going to be resurrected. We just don't know any of that. So in other words, it comes down to a kind of mystery, and this is where Dennis Edwards ends up as well. But as I said, I think I think there is more work to be done in that, and I think that, in a sense, we have to sort of put in place, what's our theological anthropology now, and what will the eschaton look like is another step. But there have been some scholars that have been working for a number of years on trying to struggle with what might this mean in terms of our future hope for the whole of the creative world. In the book of Revelation itself, it talks about a new heaven and a new earth, but it's not new in the sense that the old one is destroyed. It means, that word actually in the Greek text means renewed. It's a renewed heaven and earth. So we don't really know what's going to happen in that sense, except that it'll somehow reflect the glory of God. I hope that's sufficient. I feel it's somewhat dissatisfying to myself. So, but. You're all very tired, I'm sure, after having a full day here.
Thank you very much. You had a really interesting idea in here about love. Love as a check on unlimited freedom. I was wondering if you could expand upon that for us just a little bit.
Yeah. I think it goes back to this idea of seeing the world in a different way. We had that idea of perception. So if we learn to see the world with the eyes of love rather than the eyes of power or possession, then our desires, as it were, to use that in an instrumental way for our own benefit will start to be checked. And so that's what I meant. So there's the kind of freedom that is inappropriate freedom to do what we will and use things for our own benefit. So it's I mean, if you want to go back to the classic understanding of freedom, it's freedom to be virtuous, and that's really what we need to recover, rather than just this freedom of choice, which has become so dominant in Western civilization and in America in particular. And so I think we need to sort of see ourselves as in this ecological conversion of becoming free to become those who express the ecological virtues, and then we can have full freedom. But so it's the freedom for others and the freedom to love, as it were, the creation that's important.
Thank you, Celia. That was a really fascinating, thrilling kind of romp through the encyclical in a very imaginative way. And I have a sort of two-part question for you to see if you can help illuminate this. When you talk about beading the virtues together, the threading of the virtues, how explicit do you think Francis was about putting this forward as a new linguistic or a new nomenclature or a new agenda for theological discussion or theological ecology? How much to the fore of his mind do you think it was? And the flip part of that question, what you're referring to both, but what sources do you think was leading him, or what theological sources might he have had in his mind to address this kind of beating of or threading of the virtues, the ecological virtues?
Okay. Well, he does talk about virtues explicitly, and the need for the commitment to ecological awareness as central to the life of virtue. But in his predecessor, predecessor had Caritas in Veritate, that's love, and then there was an encyclical on hope, and then there was one on faith that was the first encyclical. So faith, hope and love, as it were always in the background, but now it's, if you, as it were, woven into this new encyclical in a practical way. So it's as if he said, okay, we've learnt about these virtues, we've learnt about their significance in the church, we've learnt about how important the theological virtues in particular are. Let's see what happens when we join this up together with something that's of fundamental importance to the way we live in terms of the natural environment. In addition to that, I think his exemplar is Francis of Assisi, who was, as it were, an exemplar of those kinds of virtues. And I know that this is, in a sense, I've called them theological threads because not all of them are virtues, but the idea of mercy, the idea of glory, the idea of joy, they are actually in the encyclical. I'm not making that up, but it's just that I'm doing, if you like, a theological reading of it. So it's a hermeneutic of this encyclical in a way which I don't think I've seen many people do, because I think they've concentrated on the economic situation, they've concentrated on discussions around the technocratic paradigm. I was trying to uncover what really theologically, spiritually is driving this encyclical, and I think I hope I haven't been distorting of his message, because I think that it does make sense. How deliberate that was, or whether it was more of an intuitive way of doing it, I don't know. I don't know how deliberate it was. But I do know that he is trying to move towards a cultural revolution. He says that a number of times, and he is talking about ecological conversion, which is a conversion of the heart. So putting the virtues, as it were, in that place of what it means in practice then to have this ecological conversion, and paying attention to Teresa of Lisieux's attention to the daily gestures. Those daily gestures only really make sense if they're gestures that are informed by virtue. So I think it, as I said, I think it does work. But I admit that it is my reading of it. It's not something that he's spelt out. So whether you're convinced or not, read the encyclical and come back and let me know.
No, I'm very persuaded by it. I think it's a great hermeneutic. So if I could just run with it a little bit more then, because you're seeing it as your interpretation, and I think it's a very robust interpretation. It wouldn't at all surprise me that that was more to the front of his mind than the back of his mind, because you can see in the way he writes in his other encyclicals, he likes to present something and then slide back from it, present and then slide back. He's anxious he seems to be anxious not to be pushing anything too firmly, lest it gets, beyond himself. So the kind of follow through, if we're not going to go to, specific scholars other than, back to Francis, who would maybe be inspiring him, maybe let me ask that in a different way. Is there anything in the encyclical that reflects the sort of theology of liberation of his own continent that was scolded by previous popes? I mean, is he trying to get back into a balance from previous scoldings, or is that a reach too far?
Well, as I said, there's a fascinating article that's been written by a Latin American scholar in theological studies, which is Laudato Si and the Theology of the People, which goes into the Latin American basis of some of the things that he's talking about. At the same time, I think as he's a Jesuit, he's also influenced by Ignatius of Loyola and his stress on detachment. being detached from those things that bind us in order to hear the voice of God, as it were, in order to hear the call of Christ, to be different. And so it's a combination of the liberation theology with the spirituality of Ignatius of Loyola that makes this a really powerful message. He does have some of his more favorite theologians and others that are cited in here, but sometimes it's hard to know whether he's putting them in as sort of representative placeholders. He has used the what I would call the Southern bishops' statements far more than any other pope has used them. So he is trying to do something a little bit different from the standard sort of Western sort of Pope Benedict version that's heavily influenced by a particular theological formulation. So it's a very contextually based theology, which is why I call it an eco-theology, because that's what eco-theologians do all the time. And because it's weaving in ecology as well as liberation theology, it's trying to join things together. Now, he hasn't shown any particular awareness or reading of eco-theologians, but I know that Sean McDonough, for example, was heavily influential on the pieces on biodiversity, and he actually wrote those sections and said that they were almost word for word. So he's borrowed pieces. I mean, unlike anyone else, the Pope is able to plagiarize, and no one minds. If he uses your stuff and then it's in the encyclical, you feel pleased rather than angry that he hasn't quoted you. So, I mean, this is, I think, but it's still his own words. It's still him, as it were, that's expressed in here in a very special kind of way. And this encyclical was released on the 18th of June, which happens to be my birthday, so I was completely delighted with that. I thought, thank you, Pope Francis, the best birthday present I've ever had, so almost. But
We have a question over here.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask if you have reflected on mourning as a virtue in relation to the ecological crisis and perhaps as a counterpoint to praise, and what role it also might have in conversion. And the reason I raise it is because I think that Catholic social thought, while it has been it's always had to deal in hope and not simply in optimism or any sense that we're going to make this all happen on our own. I wonder if the ecological crisis is such a new moment in that so much has been lost that we won't get back, and whether that gives itself a distinctive character to the virtues and the ways of responding in terms of conversion.
yes. I mean, you've put your finger on something which I think is one of the few weaknesses of the encyclical, and that he doesn't talk about mourning for the loss of species in the way that I would have liked. But he does talk about the destruction, and the problems that we have with over-attachment to technologies and why we've ended up in the situation we have and the need for ecological conversion. So I think the idea of repentance is certainly there. The idea that we must have mercy is certainly there. Someone called Ernst Conradi has done quite a lot of work in this area on the idea of mourning for the ecological devastation that we find ourselves in the midst of. And he's a South African Reform scholar, and again, someone called Dan Castillo has written a theology of lament. So this idea that we need to lament our sins, as it were. But I think the encyclical itself is quite upbeat in its theological message, even though it makes some sharp pointers about what's gone wrong. So, mercy is referred to, but not necessarily the virtue of mourning. So he sort of moves from sort of challenging us to think about what we've done wrong, maybe a little bit too quickly towards an alternative, but then he only has, it's quite a short, compressed encyclical, but I think that it could easily be filled out with more on that. So I think that's a really interesting and good point.
May I ask a question? So I've been noticing throughout the day that there have been different ways of understanding or conceptualizing the relationship between science and religion, or scientists or environmental advocacy and faith communities. And certainly here in the United States we have certain scripts about that, notions of some sort of inherent opposition and so on, that don't come out of Catholicism and that are contrary to Catholicism, but that nevertheless seem to frame people's perception, sometimes even within the tradition, about the way that Catholic commitments might orient us toward environmental issues. And then we also heard a few references to some surprising areas of leadership from evangelical communities, and noted some lack of leadership in Catholic circles around some of these issues. So I'm personally just very struck by the fact that you're trained both as a scientist and as a theologian, that your scholarship is deeply interdisciplinary, and that the administrative work that you do, right, involves convening people across these sorts of boundaries, right? So your entire research agenda is very boundary spanning. So I wonder if you might just speak from your experience to us about what you have learned in terms of bringing scientists and theologians together in a way that leads to some meaningful inquiry and action. Even this conference itself is an annual conference. I'm on the planning committee. So it's a difficult needle to thread each year in terms of identifying interlocutors who are capable of speaking to each other, want to speak to each other, have sufficient understanding of one another's worlds to enter into that dialogue. So what can you tell us?
Okay. I mean, this is a great question. I think it sort of appears in one of the slides I have on dialogue, where I talk about there's a need for generosity. I'm trying to find them. Maybe I can go back. Because I think that sort of puts the finger on, here we are. It demands patience, self-discipline and generosity. That is the starting point, I think. And it's also finding people who are open enough and willing to talk to those who have been traditionally marginalized in the academy. Notre Dame is unusual in that it's a Catholic, because it's a Catholic university, and this applies to here as well. Scientists aren't freaked necessarily by the idea of theology or religion. So, but it does then mean there's an ideal opportunity then for the possibility of conversations. And I've found that the dialogue has been really interesting, not least because it's not just about theology adapting to or responding to the latest, say, evolutionary biology or the latest understanding of ecological relationships, but it's also about that theology feeding ideas that may take the research slightly differently within those disciplines themselves. And this has happened to me again and again and again in the last especially the last 5 years or so. I'll give you an example. Probably about 10 years ago, I thought to myself while I was at Chester that it would be really interesting to do something on the evolution of wisdom, because I'm sure Ursula will know all about this, but there's been quite a lot of work on the evolution of altruism, but I couldn't find anything on the evolution of something more complex like wisdom. And to cut a long story short, when I came for the interview in Notre Dame, one of the people I happened to meet, which was again one of these chances, because Agustin Fuentes was then the director of ISLA, which is the Institute for the Study in the Liberal Arts. We met each other and we started talking about common interests, and then somehow this subject came up and we went way off what we were supposed to be talking about and went on for about an hour and a half speaking. And so when I came, we already had started this relationship, and we developed then this project on human distinctiveness. And then I had a sabbatical leave in Princeton where we worked, he also had a similar leave at the Centre for Theological Inquiry. And so that relationship could develop with, you know, a number of others. Both many of the scientists who joined us didn't even know what theology was, never mind that they wanted to speak with theologians, but they were given this sabbatical leave, and we had to very patiently work out each other's language and what it meant. And by the end of it, you know, we had people like Richard Sosis, who's a well-known evolutionary social scientist and anthropologist, getting really interested in some of the philosophical and the theological questions. And I think and then the other one, the other project was with psychology on the virtues of science, the developing in the practices of science. So I think it's often it's about the people you happen to meet who are generous enough, as it were, to have that kind of conversation. But it does start to change and shift, I think, the status of theology in the university. It no longer becomes the Cinderella subject that people are embarrassed to be theologians. Because there is a push, certainly in England, for people to become religious studies scholars and squeeze out the theology. But I think that theology has something distinctive to add to the academy. There's a wisdom in theology that you don't get necessarily from the methodology of religious studies that tends to imitate the social sciences. So I think that, you know, that in terms of the ecological task, you know, we have started, as a centre, now talking to the Environmental Change Initiative. And their work is all very practical and very mission orientated in terms to try and encourage people to look at the local region of the area and think more about the ecology and develop wetland sites and things which are, if you like, go back to the original sort of native wetland grasses. And one of the things they've started to get interested in is what would happen if we started bringing in a religious thread into this as well, and we don't really know where it's going to go. So I think there are, if you like, it's risky, and it's sometimes unclear what the puzzles will be, but it's about having those initial conversations and then moving forward in terms of asking new kind of research questions together. You know, a shared common interest. So maybe a shared common interest in virtue from psychology, the history and philosophy of science, and then theology, a shared common interest in ecological questions, and so on and so forth. So I think there are, you know, I've made it my mission, as it were, in my writing to try and get a balance in the discussion. So it's not just about, you know, how do theologians adapt their understanding of what it means for God to be creator in the light of evolution. I want it to be bolder than that, and to say something to scientists as well. Whether they will read it or not is another matter, but it's through these conversations that you start to influence scientists in a different way. And I have written a joint article with Agustin Fuentes, and now we're publishing 2 books together as well as edited collections. So I think it's a slow process and it takes time, but it's also very exciting and very energizing, and you're really, if you like, moving the academy in a different direction in a way which I think is really vitally needed. And this is also what I think Pope Francis is calling for in this encyclical. And I didn't want to just sort of pick out something like this and say, well, we've been doing it for years or anything like that. But I think he is encouraging, you know, different groups to come together and to start to try and understand one another's language, and start to recognize that true wisdom is about putting these pieces together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Celia, for your presentation. I really like the 8-fold theological strands. I'm going to have to think about that for a while. And I have 1,000 questions, but we don't have much time and everyone's tired. So, but I want to go back to this dialogue between science and theology, because scientific contributions and religious perspectives. And you bring a unique perspective as someone who is trained in both. And the one thread that I was very curious about was this idea of awe and wonder. And I know many scientists say it begins with awe and wonder for whatever it is that they're studying. And I know that's a strand in the theological perspective as well. So could you talk, as a scientist and a theologian, what kind of practices bring out awe and wonder? And are there any that are shared? I don't know, that's kind of an open question.
No, that's a good question. I've actually, I wrote a book in 2005 called Wonder and Wisdom, Conversations in Science, Spirituality and Theology. So if you want to know a bit more what I think, then because there isn't time, then maybe read that. But we have, just to give you an example, I'm teaching a class this semester called Theology for a Fragile Earth. And one of the things we're doing, because one of my colleagues is a Holy Cross priest, but he's also trained as an ecologist. One of the things we're doing is getting students to go out and spend 10 minutes every day observing a tree, and it's called the Tree Project. They have to switch their phones off, detach from technologies, observe where the tree is, where the sun is, and various other observations. And they sit there day after day for 7 weeks in my class. In his class, they go on for 14 weeks. And many of them have said this has been transformative. And we also do a field trip with them to Warren Woods, which is one of the most fragile woodland areas as well in the Michigan, or in the whole sort of region. And I think that, if people don't have the experience of getting out and spending time, they're not going to have these experiences of awe and wonder. So it's, if you like, it's beginning to sort of allow those who aren't necessarily scientists to get into the frame of what awe and wonder in science is all about. And the same in the classroom, introducing the science students, because I have a few of those, to the awe and wonder in texts and in religious experience. So it's a combination of the two. Now, in my own sort of book on awe and wonder, I say that wonder on its own isn't enough. We need wisdom, because I use some philosophical discussions on wonder to talk about wonder as the kind of hinge that opens us up to the possibility of something else. But it doesn't really give us much guidance. So we need this other strand of wisdom to then tell us what to do with it, as it were. So and I think that, we need the wonder, we need the awe, but we also need the wisdom. And moving, as I said, I think having practices alongside other forms of experience, including lectures and other things, is really important to get that awe and wonder on the table. And maybe having those who are involved in, not necessarily involved in a religious community, actually going to, different churches and maybe just sitting in on some of that, just to witness it, even if they can't necessarily take part themselves. I mean, I haven't done that here, but at Chester I did a course where we went to a Baptist, we went to Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and we went to a Catholic Mass. We in other words, we exposed students to these different traditions to try and help them understand what is it about awe or wonder in that particular tradition, because it's different for different traditions. They get their sense of awe and wonder slightly differently. So I think it's important to try and understand one another, and you could apply it to other religious traditions as well if you're doing a multi-faith course. And I know that Richard Dawkins has written about this as well. So even the most hardened of scientists have a deep sense of awe and wonder, and E.O. Wilson talks about biophilia, which is quite similar in some ways to that sentiment. In fact, he talks about wonder as well in his book Biophilia. So it's a common strand, and I think that it often motivates scientists to do their work. I know when I was a scientist, I was just fascinated by the way the world, the way things sort of worked or functioned. I became a plant physiologist because I didn't want to chop up animals, and I had a number of arguments with my tutor at Cambridge about not wanting to use animals that have been destroyed, as it were, for the sake of student benefit. At that time they were using rabbits that were pithed, that's had their needles put into their brain and stirred around on such a regular basis, and I started to object, and I got into quite a bit of trouble for doing it. So that's how I ended up being a botanist for that reason. So it's a strange reason perhaps, but there was the sense then that these things are ethical. What we do as scientists are also ethical. We have to watch what we use or what we do, how we observe. I didn't mind so much grinding up pea plants or other things. It didn't feel like they were crying out to me in pain, as it were. But I was still fascinated by the results, and I think allied to awe and wonder, there's a sort of intuitive sense of what the question needs to be, which is quite closely related to that. And I think that one of the things that we've been doing in our research at Notre Dame is bringing together postdoctoral teams, so those who are scientists alongside those who are humanities scholars, alongside theologians, all working together in these groups so that they feel like they sit with one another and share their ideas and talk about what their experiences are at that sort of formative postdoctoral stage, so they can then, you know, go on and later on in their careers having had at least a taste of what it's like indirectly through someone else, and that's been really successful as well. So that's enough.
Celia, thank you very much. What a wonderful finale to our study group, our discussion, our considerations today. So this is the end of the formal end of the presentation, and I'd like to have an applause for Celia for her yeoman's work. And let me say thank you to all of the communities globally who are still streaming or looking at this as a video afterwards. It's been lovely having you at a distance in hyperspace. Thank you for joining our conference. We will be meeting again annually, so next year around this time we'll be in contact with you. Tomorrow morning is a stakeholder discussion. There's no formal presentations tomorrow. So those of you who are planning to come to the stakeholder discussion, at 9 o'clock we have a little breakfast, and then we begin at 9:30 for a few hours with lunch at noon. So I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you all very much indeed.